Hey guys, Steve from Vorsprung Suspension in Whistler, BC here. Making another workshop video running you through some suspension technology again today, especially since the response to the last video we put up was really positive, and that was really cool to hear. So thank you all for that. One shock that we happen to have in the workshop today that I really think is quite cool and wanted to show you guys is this little unit from Trek. Now this is a Fox float CTD with a ReAktiv damper. So the ReAktiv damper, for any of you guys that don't know, this little thing is technology developed by Penske. So what it is a regressive compression damper as opposed to the standard linear and digressive compression dampers found in most shops. This one being a Trek specific unit, the damper is specific to Trek, as is the airspring. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the DRCV concept, so we're going to explain both the spring and how the damper works. Alright guys, so we've got this DRCV ReAktiv shock part here. For those of you who aren't familiar with how the DRCV system works, we have inside here the air shaft. So this threads into the damper seal head here. So the air shaft doubles as the damper body. We also have the air can that screws in like so. So the way this is laid out at this end is very much like a standard Fox float shock. So what that means is that we have an equalization dimple just there. I think you can see that. What that means is when the piston is at that point, air can flow around the piston, around the air piston, from the positive chamber, which is between this air piston here and this bulkhead in here, and the negative chamber, which is behind the air piston and between the air piston and the air seal head here. So at this point, when the piston's right there, then air can get around the seals, can bypass the seals and fill up the negative chamber. That means as the shock extends back past that point, it compresses the air in the negative chamber. So that creates your, it's sort of a negative spring, but the pressure in these drops off so rapidly in the negative spring, as it does in all the old style Fox air cans, that it's almost more of a pneumatic top out bumper. So in the positive air spring though is where the interesting stuff really happens. So the primary positive chamber is this area here, so between the eyelet and the air piston here. So as we compress the shock, air is compressed between the seals that are normally on this piston here and this bulkhead in here. So it keeps compressing the air, building up pressure quite rapidly until this little plunger that you can see here is contacted by the seal head. And once it hits that plunger, that opens a valve. It's going to be very hard to see in there with this light. Maybe not. So the valve that you can see just in here, that opens up, and that in turn joins a secondary chamber, which is in the head of the eyelet here. So this chamber here is then allowed to communicate, as in transfer air and air pressure from the primary positive chamber to the secondary positive chamber. The benefit of doing this, and the reason that Trek have done this, and they've done it for quite a long time now, although they've since moved away from this, interestingly. The reason that they did this is so that you could, in theory, have better mid-stroke support, because this volume ramped up very quickly, but without it ramping up so hard at the end of the stroke that you couldn't use all of your travel. And so the idea would be that it would ramp up very quickly, give you good support, relatively stiff spring rate, and then once it contacts this point, all of a sudden it opens up, the spring rate actually drops right off, and you can use full travel because it's no longer ramping up so violently. It's quite a good idea. The execution obviously is what matters. Some people loved it, some people didn't. The problem that it didn't address though was that the idea of using a high pressure and a high compression ratio in the first part of the stroke, so that it would be quite stiff in the middle of the stroke, works well to an extent. The problem is that by not addressing the negative chamber issue, it still made it quite harsh off the very start of the travel. It was no different to a standard float there. So you still had the same issue that if you bumped the pressure up to get support, then you sacrificed a lot of small bump compliance. Anyway, we'll get to that one again a bit later. The really interesting stuff though is inside here. So inside the damper body of a float, you typically have two components. You have this is your damper body, and this one here is your damper piston. So this is what does all of the damping duties. Inside the body here, we'll have a floating piston like this one here. So this is what they call the IFP, the internal floating piston, or independent floating piston, depending on who you ask. So this sits in the damper body, sits down about here, and through this little port here, we charge nitrogen, and that pressurizes the whole thing. So that means that when this IFP is sitting down about here, and we have the damper piston pushing through there, oil isn't simply being pushed ahead of the damper piston because there's resistance to flow through there. The nitrogen charge there pressurizes the oil and makes sure that there's enough pressure in there to actually force the oil through the damping piston. If there isn't enough pressure there, that's what leads to cavitation. So cavitation is commonly misconstrued as aeration of the oil. People think, oh, my oil sounds squishy, there's air in it, that must be cavitation. That isn't what cavitation is. Cavitation is a purely dynamic phenomenon. Only happens when there is actually motion. And what it refers to is the pressure ahead of the piston not being larger than the pressure drop over the piston. So if the pressure here is 100 psi, but at this velocity the piston should generate a pressure difference of say 200 psi, well, we'll never get to 200 psi at that point, but if the pressure difference over the piston is higher than what the pressure that's forcing oil through there can actually provide, then it simply draws a vacuum behind here, and as a result, as soon as you draw a vacuum, you do two things. You draw air out of the oil. That one isn't such a big deal in the long term because that air that was already dissolved in there can be redissolved once it repressurizes. And it also actually boils the fluid locally. And what that means is that, or why that happens is because the boiling point of any fluid is dependent not only upon its pressure, not only upon its temperature, but also the pressure that it's at. So if the pressure drops, so does the boiling temperature. So what we're actually seeing is like a form of localized boiling of your fluid. When I say boiling, I mean, of course, converting from a liquid to a vapor state. So that's the job of the IFP. This is not going to be news to a lot of you watching this. Inside here, though, this is the ReAktiv damper that's designed by Penske. The concept is originated from Penske anyway. They've worked closely with Trek. This has been passed on to Fox in manufacturing. So the system that I have here is quite interesting. It's very different from anything else currently inside a mountain bike shock, and I'll show you why in a sec. The concept and the idea is that you have a regressive curve where the damping force actually drops as the speed goes up after a certain point. So the damping force increases, and then all of a sudden the valve opens and the damping force drops right off. With most dampers, referred to as digressive dampers, that means the damping force starts, the damping curve, which is force versus velocity, starts steep and then gets flatter. The force never actually decreases. If the speed increases, the force is always higher. It might not be that much higher, and the rate at which it increases can change, but the force never actually drops. With a regressive damper, as opposed to a digressive damper, the force does drop. Now, the idea behind this is that you now have a usable pedaling platform. that you can run very firm, and it can completely get out of its, the term that Trek uses, get out of its own way. So what that means is that you have an impact to the shock that provides enough pressure to open the valve, and all of a sudden the resistance suddenly drops and the thing can move very quickly. I'll show you the mechanism by which this occurs. So inside, with this shock, as with all CTD shocks, you have three positions of the pedal platform lever. So you have open, medium, firm, climb, trail, descend, open pedal, close, whatever you want to call it. Inside this piston, what that's doing is, I'm just going to take my time getting this little cap off. Inside here, what that's doing, you can see this plunger with a spring on top of it. There's a little wave spring here. I'll pull that right out so you can see that. A little wave spring. So what that's doing is pushing that plunger up, which provides more preload on the spring. See that? Okay. What the spring in turn is doing is putting pressure on the gold plate inside this black cap. Now this is where it gets really quite interesting. This idea of having something that has preload on it, like a valve that has preload on it before it opens, is not new. That's pretty standard in everything. In everything that's designed to be pedaled any distance anyway. But what is really, really interesting, I'm just going to hose this out because it's a bit oily. What is really interesting, and I'm not sure if you can make it out too clearly on the camera there. See the profile of those oil flow ports, the big ones around the outside? So you can see there that there is a lip. Point to that lip. Slip just here. See that in the light? So what that means is that when the valve is closed, you only have the area of that actual port. So I'm going to try to aim this. You have the area of this actual port here, where you can see the light through. That oil can apply pressure to the regressive valve, to try and open it. But once it actually cracks open, and all of a sudden the valve lifts away from this point and off this lip, oil can flow around the lip and under the rest of the valve. And so all of a sudden there is massively more surface area for the oil to be acting on. And so for those of you who have studied physics, you'd be aware that force is pressure times area. So the amount of oil pressure, which is uniform throughout the oil, acting on a larger surface area now means there's much more force trying to force that valve open. So that then means that this thing is forced much further away from the ports. So the ports open up a massive distance, disproportionately far, as compared to, say, a shim damper, a boost valve, or any other system currently in use in the mountain bike world. The result is that drop in damping force, because this valve, once oil pressure can reach the cavities around those ports, around here, and get under the valve and apply that pressure over a much larger area, then it's much easier to hold that valve open. Now this presents a couple of interesting phenomena. First of all is the fact that the closing and opening characteristics of this valve are completely different. In some circles, this would be seen as hysteresis, which is, in a practical sense, a lag of a valve to respond to an input. So you start moving the suspension, and it takes a certain amount of time and a certain amount of displacement of the suspension for the damping to actually generate, a certain amount of force. The bigger thing that this does is that it involves very sudden changes in pressure. So as you can imagine, when when the oil pressure that's here, it's coming through the piston, all of a sudden is acting on a much larger area, and then the valve opens much further, the oil can flow through much more readily, and that means the pressure drops. So now you have high pressure, valve opens, pressure suddenly drops. What happens then? That means that the pressure that was used to open the valve initially then disappears, and the spring that's pushing the valve closed tries to close it. So then you end up with what is effectively a dynamically unstable valve. And you can see this in dyno plots of these valves. Some of them are actually published on Penske's website for those of you who care enough to dig around and have a look. And what you'll see is that you get these loops in the dyno curve, in the force versus characteristic, force versus velocity characteristic, which indicates that dynamic instability. It's the valve constantly opening and closing. And because the motions of suspension in general are relatively random, then you get a lot of that. And the real question here is, like, is the benefit of the valve large enough to overcome the fact that it's very hard to precisely measure or quantify exactly what amount of resistance you're getting at any given velocity or in response to any given input? Obviously, Trek and Penske believe the answer is yes, there is enough benefit to justify that. Penske do use this regressive valve in some of their Indy and Formula One car dampers, I believe. Interestingly though, they use it in rebound, not in compression. There's a whole other topic on that one, but I'm not about to get into race car handling dynamics, other than to say they're obviously fairly different from mountain bikes. So once we get past this part, this in my opinion is the really interesting part of the damper. Once we get past here, the oil has opened this valve, flowed past there, then enters the main piston here. So that cool little spool you can see in there, that is the spool that adjusts the spring preload. And beneath that we have also your rebound shim stack that we can see in here. Let's see if we can get good light on that. Yeah, so the rebound shim stack is, I'm just going to point out again with this little needle, these shims here. So when the shock is rebounding, oil is flowing in through two places. It's coming in through the rebound, like the low speed rebound port here, which is then metered by the rebound adjuster up here. So that controls a rod that goes and closes off a gap inside this tube, and that restricts the flow of oil through there. For the high speed portion, well, it's not really high speed in this case because this is a linear rebound damper with no preload on it. The oil flows in through these ports underneath these shims. Can you see that there? Just in there. And then once it goes through there, comes out through small ports underneath these shims here. So it flexes those shims open. This is the way that a shim damper works. The shims cover a small hole, and again, many of you will already know this. Shims cover a small hole and they bend away according to how much oil pressure is acting on them. That means that you don't have the resistance build up too suddenly or in what is a quadratic curve. So that means as you double the velocity of the damper, the resistance would be quadrupled, and that isn't beneficial for what we're trying to do. So that's the rebound component there. The compression shim stack is actually similarly simple. So we have just a standard shim stack on the back there. I'm sure you can see that. So this one here, oil is flowing in through these 9 large holes that we can see in there. You see all that? And that comes out through underneath these shims. I'm just trying to get an angle you guys can see there. It comes out underneath these shims here, so it flexes the shims open. So the shims behave much like a spring. They're sealing off those ports, and with enough force it can peel them up and open them. As a general rule, an unpreloaded shim stack will give you quite a linear characteristic within the limitations of the port geometry and whatnot. So the rebound damping here is adjusted in the same way and valved in the same way as a stock float shock. There's nothing special there for the most part. There is the real interesting part of this shock, in my opinion, is the ReAktiv damper. So as I was saying, with the regressive valve, because of that sudden motion and the sharp changes in pressure there that you don't really get with other forms of damper, or at least not to the same extent, you also have added issues of noise. Clunking is quite common in the climb and trail modes of these, not so much in the descend mode where it's a bit open. And you also have a relatively large displacement of the valve. And that doesn't happen in most shim valves because they only open according to the pressure that's acting on them quite linearly. There isn't a huge amount of overshoot. It can happen to a certain degree with poppet valves, and you'll sometimes hear valve flutter. For anyone with a Boss Kirk shock, if you flip the lockout lever on and then have a bounce on your shock, you'll probably notice like a goose honking noise, which is the poppet valves in the high-speed compression fluttering, and that is because when you've shut off the low-speed circuit with the lockout, all the oil is being forced through the high-speed, but it needs to build up a certain amount of pressure before it can open the valve at all, and then it suddenly dumps pressure, which closes the valve, and then pressure quickly builds up again, which opens the valve, and this is happening, hundreds or thousands of times a second, which results in that flutter. Cane Creek and Fox avoid this in their poppet valves, like in the X2 shock and the double barrel I was looking at the other day, by having a bleed shim on the nose of the poppet. So the poppet can actually allow a certain amount of bleed past it before the spring is overcome. Anyway, enough rambling about that one. Back to the air spring characteristic of this one. So as I mentioned earlier, and this is true of both the Fox float line of shocks, including the DRCVs and the older style floats, as well as all the Cane Creek air springs and the older RockShox stuff as well. In fact, it's pretty much every air spring up until the last couple of years. So having such a small negative chamber there means that as the shock compresses, with such a small volume in there, in order for that pressure to drop off hugely, it does not take much displacement. And that means that has very little effect on the mid-stroke, and it acts almost more as like a pneumatic top-out cushion than a true negative spring. So with the Corset air sleeve, by contrast, what that lets us do is have a much bigger negative chamber. You can see the difference in the size of the chamber there. This is the sleeve specifically for the remedy that this shock came off. And because of that, the pressure in the negative chamber drops much more slowly, meaning that you get both more mid-stroke control and also much better small bump compliance at the start of the stroke. It's nowhere near as stiff. Interestingly, Fox and Trek have seemed to have recognized this, and the 2016 and onward Treks don't come with DRCV anymore. They come with Fox's Evol sleeve, which is based on the same concept as the Corset, with a larger negative chamber. From what we've measured, they don't go anywhere near as far with it as we do, which I can only assume is because of their need to essentially make a shock that works for everyone. Whereas for us, we can say, okay, the pressure you need is going to be too high, this isn't going to work for you. Or the bike you're on is too progressive, this isn't going to work for you. Fox, by contrast, have to make a shock. They can't say, no, you're too fat to ride shock, and they need to make something that bike manufacturers aren't going to go, well, we've just lost a bunch of sales because the shock that you made doesn't actually work for half of our customers. What we can do, by contrast, is make something where it works extremely well for most people, and then it doesn't work at all for some people. For example, if you own a Norco range, don't buy a Corset. They do not work well on those frames. And likewise for other extremely progressive frames. Anyway, back to the DRCV. The interesting thing that I found with this, and this is largely by coincidence, when we put a Corset on it, we found that the spring rate that we got was almost dead linear throughout the stroke. And if you guys have a look at the graphs that have been posted up on our Facebook page, middle of last year I think, and those on our website, you can see how linear it actually is. It really is about as close to a coil spring as you can physically get out of an air spring, which I think is really cool. As far as whether that is exactly what you want, not always the case. If you do a lot of seated riding, and by which I mean you're a cross-country rider predominantly, then the curve offered by an old style air sleeve can actually be beneficial. And so the reason I say this is the concept of running less sag and having a stiffer initial stroke is more beneficial in terms of steepening the geometry of your bike when you're climbing and when you're doing a lot of seated pedaling. It also means that if you're seated, one can reasonably safely assume that your back wheel isn't leaving the ground too frequently while you're seated. That means that you're not entering that first region of the travel quite so often, quite so violently, and as a result, the benefits that something like the Corset gives you in terms of descending and like outright bump absorption are negated by the fact that you're not actually in the region of travel that benefits the most, and you are, however, having a slacker geometry. My opinion is that trail bike geometry will, and it's not even an opinion, it's actually proven in fact already by bikes like the Transition Patrol. Trail bike geometry will adjust for suspension that has, what is, from a performance point of view, a much more appropriate level of sag, which is around the 30% mark for most things, 25 to 30%, instead of running 20% on a lot of cross-country bikes. And once the geometry sharpens up to accommodate for that, so relatively steep seat tube angle being the big one, slightly higher starting point for your bottom bracket, and potentially steeper starting point for your head angle, although I realize it's absolutely blasphemy to ever suggest that your head angle should be steeper rather than slacker. When those things are considered, then we end up with a bike that just works better everywhere, because we don't need to worry about slackening the bike when we're climbing. And on that note, there's another bike that really doesn't work well with the Corset, is anything with a super slack seat tube angle if you do a lot of climbing. A good example of that is the Yeti SB6. Suspension performance, sorry, not SB6, SB6 is great, SB66. Suspension performance, way better, but the seat tube angle on those is so slack to start with that any increase in sag really does sit it back a long way. Which obviously it is happening to a far lesser extent with the stock Can. Anyway, I hope that was somewhat insightful into the ReAktiv shocks, the DRCV system, the Corset, and a lot about air springs. This is something obviously that we take a great deal of interest in, and we're always trying to improve what we do, analyze what everyone else does, and try and make things work as well as they physically can. For those who have asked, and I get a lot of emails about this, the ReAktiv shocks, yes, they do work really well with the Corset, because the lockout on these is extremely firm to start with, and the only real request that we tend to get from people in terms of revalving with Corsets is that on certain bikes where the rate of geometric anti-squat drops off as sag increases, the pedal bob also then increases if you increase the sag. So when you install an air sleeve, that means more sag, like the Corset. Then you get something that pedals worse unless the compression, like the low speed compression or the lockout, is firmed up to suit. Now this doesn't apply to every bike. Some bikes actually pedal better with more sag. Those of you on VPP bikes, the feedback we've had is extremely good for running more sag. But anyway, at the risk of this turning into an advertorial for the Corset, I'm going to leave it at that. And if you guys have any questions or anything else you want to know, by all means hit me up in the comments below, and we'll see what we can do. Cheers.